Tao Feng, Fist of the Lotus, released in 2003 exclusively for the original Xbox courtesy of Microsoft Game Studios and Studio Gigante, which is the developer founded by the other Mortal Kombat co-creator John Tobias. Studio Gigante started up in 2000 and made 2 whole games in their entire lifespan. The first being Tao Feng, today's subject matter, and the other being WWE WrestleMania 21 before shutting its doors in 2005. I have both games, by the way, and one day we'll look at the game that killed the studio for good, but that day is not today because it is not a new day. No, it's not. Okay, cut that last line out. That sounds like shit. Tao Feng Fist of the Lotus is a one-on-one fighting game, which shouldn't be too much of a surprise considering who is at the helm. You have 12 playable characters to choose from, and the roster is split between 2 factions, the Pale Lotus and the Black Mantis. These are your heroes and villains respectively, your baby faces and heels, whatever the vernacular you want to use, that sort of thing. This is relevant for later on, but for now let's focus on the core gameplay. So this is a fighting game similar in vein to a Tekken or Virtua Fighter or Dead or Alive. You fight along a 2D plane, but you can sidestep here and there to move around in this 3D space, which is actually encouraged in this game, for reasons we'll get into. Naturally, the goal is to defeat your opponent, and this usually entails knocking them down 3 times. Matches play out similarly to Killer Instinct. There are no rounds per se, but you have 3 stocks of health to burn through before you're eventually defeated. However, if you prefer your fighting games to be somewhat more traditional for lack of a better term, there is an option to enable rounds, and you could set the number of rounds needed to win, and you could have fun all the same. In any event, it's the same thing. You knock your opponent down, they get up looking worse for wear, and the fight continues, so... There's a couple things that makes Tao Feng somewhat unique. First off, you could use your surroundings to perform additional attacks, bounce off walls, swing across poles and such, crash into pieces of furniture, that sort of thing. Not something you see all that often back then, but we get there eventually, I assume. Another feature was limb damage, basically inflict enough damage to a limb to minimize its effectiveness. Blocking too often will also result in limb damage over time, and eventually you're left with damaged arms that result in weaker punches and weaker defense. It's a nice way of varying up strategies, at least on paper. One last thing which is less unique is your chi meter. As you land blows, you'll build up chi, and once it's full, you can execute chi attacks, which are actually quite simple to execute. You could also use chi to heal damaged limbs, so that's another thing. There isn't a standard arcade mode type thing to play here. You know, pick a fighter, beat all the rest, and a couple bosses to get a fancy ending. That doesn't exist here. Instead, you have a quest mode, where you pick one of 2 factions, then a member of your chosen faction, and beat all the members of the rival faction to gain pieces of an artifact, depends on the fighter. And you do this for all 6 fighters on your faction to eventually challenge the game's final boss, Zhao Yan, in a group battle type scenario. It's certainly a unique take on a story mode for a fighting game, but they don't do much with the concept. All you get is some pre-fight narration detailing the backstory between the 2 fighters, and that's about it. You don't even get unique animations or cutscenes for the occasions. Other modes are a bit more traditional in nature, a versus mode, a survival mode, a training mode, tournament mode, and a team battle mode, some of which can only be played with a second player. Tao Feng is an interesting fighter that took a while for me to get into. Surface level shows a typical 3D fighter for its day, but there's a little more to it than that. Learning to move around in your surroundings, using the environment to your advantage, and varying up strategies in order to minimize the limb damage on your end while inflicting on the other end is what makes Tao Feng somewhat special, unique, I don't know the proper term, but it's certainly something. Control is pretty straightforward, it's fairly responsive for the most part with little to no hiccups, and there's a handy dandy moves list so you can learn how to pull off all them combos and stuff. Which is good because this is not a pick up and play sort of deal, it's a take your damn time and learn how things work to gain the slightest hope that you'll play this game properly, much less get good. Once you get the hang of it, Tao Feng can be a fun time, especially with a like-minded second player. Otherwise, if you can't get into it, I certainly can't blame you. I remember back in the day when I just got my Xbox and a bunch of games, one of which was Tao Feng, and we tried it, we hated it. So, this was a game that I never had an urge to revisit until fairly recently, and when I did, I was like, not as bad as I thought it was going to be. Of course, your mileage and patience is going to vary with this regard, so... Tao Feng's strongest aspect is its visual presentation, and this isn't a surprise really. I've seen many Xbox games, particularly those exclusive to the platform, pull off some exceptional graphics for its day, and this is no exception. The character designs are rather hit and miss, that's as far as I'll go in that regard, but the way they generally look, the way they move, the environments and such, all of that looks pretty splendid by 2003 console standards at least. Of particular note is the wear and tear that the fighters suffer as they absorb more damage, whether it be bruises, blood scuffs, or torn fabrics. Wasn't something you saw all that often back in the day, so it was a particularly nice touch. What's not such a nice touch was that every so often, without warning no less, the camera would cut to a different angle, flipping the playfield so that you're both facing the opposite direction. I have no idea why anyone thought this was a good idea, because it not only messes with you from a gameplay standpoint, but it's also pretty jarring that you're getting a jump cut. Not even a camera spin, but a straight up jump cut. That's my one big issue with Tao Feng's visual presentation, which is otherwise quite stunning. Sound-wise, it's okay. There's quite a bit of voice acting and the narrator of these things, the various fighters and such. The lines themselves have a hint of the corn, if you will, but the performances themselves are fine. I have no issues with those. Sound effects are pretty standard fare for this sort of thing. They sound fairly crisp and clear. The music is largely befitting the setting, some techno-ish tunes with a bit of local flavor, if you will. Perfectly acceptable, but otherwise largely forgettable background music to fill the void of silence during the fight. It is fine otherwise. Tao Feng Fist of the Lotus is best described as an acquired taste, for lack of a better term. It's one of those games that doesn't seem like much at first glance. It really needs a bit of time before you start to get a groove for how the mechanics work and all that. It's a fantastic looking Xbox game, and there's a couple good ideas in there, but there's also a bit of a learning curve to overcome before you can really appreciate what it's trying to do. All in all, I found Tao Feng Fist of the Lotus to be a perfectly adequate fighting game, and is one worth checking out if you're in the mood for something different for whatever that's worth. It's not going to be to everyone's liking, but fortunately the Xbox had more than its fair share of quality fighting games. Still, for what it's worth, Tao Feng has its moments.